Then we have the developments in the virtual world and the social media, which are having such a huge impact on our culture. In politics, we see fragmentation and perhaps a certain disillusionment. I'm conscious that there has been a lot of progress in some respects. One metric would be life expectancy in India, which is a country I know and love. But despite the improvement in many economic metrics, there's a very widespread sense that we've lost our way. And so at this particular historical moment, it seems to me that we have to find a methodology and an orientation through which to begin to get on the right track. We don't know exactly where the right track will lead us, but we can work on the criteria and we can make a kind of compass for ourselves. And this certainly includes finding a bigger language. That's a phrase that I borrow from a friend. But we need to get back to words like trust and truth and justice and mercy and hope. Could we go to the next slide? Now, you will all know this better than me, but I find a lot of comfort in certain reference points in scripture. And I start with the Roman census because there's a move, I think, in this new multilateralism to say that governments and big corporations and other actors are all on the same footing. And I think it's important to say that government has a particular role in all of this. And I think that's implied by the way the gospel story opens with the census. Then there's the question of the sharing of goods in the Acts of the Apostles, leading on to the role of St. Stephen and the importance of service within the church. And in my view, the letter to Philemon poses a radical challenge to the institution of slavery, because the kind of relationship which St. Paul proposes between the slave and the slave owner is ultimately incompatible with how the institution functions. And here I would go back to the passage in St. Luke where Jesus promises at the beginning of his mission to bring freedom to captives. It seems to me those captives could be slaves, people taken in war as slaves. And so the whole prophetic tradition comes into play as we look at these issues. The Good Samaritan story tells us that we have to start with our response to situations. We have to see and feel that something is wrong. That comes from a spirit of mercy. And so it may be that we'll cross certain denominational lines or other divisions among us as we respond to need. And of course, the whole vision of the Creator and the world as being a loving creation suggests that we have one human family. So not only do we reach beyond our own borders, but we have to think in terms of humanity as a whole. Could we go to the next slide? Now, to ask ourselves, we have to start asking ourselves what all this means in practice. Let us say we assume that engagement in the public sphere is one very important aspect of love and of the revelation of Christ. How should we imagine that? And I think we have to see the churches and the public sphere as separate but interrelated. There are different responsibilities in each of the spheres, and they have to be respected. So the task then is to zoom in, if you like, on how to implement this relationship in practice. And my center in DCU, in which I have the help of several good friends, is trying to become a center of excellence in this area. We start with the human rights principle of freedom of religion or belief. This has implications not just for privately held opinions or doctrines, but it has implications for the community dimension of faith, for education, for communication. And in fact, this fundamental human right implies a voice for the churches and for religions. And I think the best expression of that so far in the international sphere is Article 17 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. And I think it's worth reading this out because it's a kind of gold standard at the moment. The Union respects and does not prejudice the status under national law of churches and religious associations or communities. The Union equally respects the status of philosophical, non-confessional organizations, and recognizing their identity and their specific contribution, the Union shall maintain an open, transparent, and regular dialogue with these churches and organizations. So here we have both the recognition that churches are not NGOs. They have a very particular role, which is recognized by the European Union. And then we also have the commitment to an open, transparent, and regular dialogue. Now, similar ideas are being implemented in individual countries around the world, in the UN, in the OSCE, in the Council of Europe, the African Union, the G20, but I don't think it has been stated as clearly in what the basis is as in Article 17. And it seems to me that we have a couple of quite significant opportunities arising in the next few years to make our voice heard. One is the Conference on the Future of Europe within the European Union, which is to be formally launched on the 9th of May. The Irish government and a number of other governments are saying that this conference should be about ideas, not nuts and bolts. And this is logical because if we want to involve citizens, citizens are not necessarily briefed on the complexities of the institutional issues that arise, but citizens do know the shape of the society that we want to see. And so if this is to be a conference about ideas, there's scope for a contribution, in terms of this bigger language I was referring to. And of course, the churches cross frontiers, and I think it's impossible in a church context to talk about the future of Europe only in the context of the 27 member states of the European Union. And another opportunity that arises, I would say, is the 50th anniversary of the Helsinki Final Act. The Helsinki Final Act was 1975, and it instituted a values-led process of dialogue across the whole of Europe, including North America and Russia, and including important Muslim majority countries such as Turkey. The initial vision has faded, but the 50th anniversary could be an opportunity to revive some of those ideas. Now, to stand back for a moment from the points I've made and ask a question that's more basic. What's really happening when public authorities and churches and religious communities come together? And it seems to me that there are maybe different perspectives that need to be reconciled. Governments nowadays recognize, by and large, the need for cultural competence and religious literacy. Those have become buzzwords, really. And also the need for partnerships in certain circumstances in delivering healthcare or education. And I think that this is open to discussion, but I think the big breakthrough here in the Western world came in the United States after 9/11, when the US woke up to the need to understand the cultures of Middle Eastern countries. But from the church point of view, there's more than just cultural competence involved. There's the question of the voice, dialogue, advocacy, transformation. And what's at stake, it seems to me, is the difference between an ethos and the law, or the difference between relationships and rules. Every society needs a kind of pre-political culture which gives us the standpoint from which to criticize the laws. And when we talk about equity as a value, that actually means bringing values which are not fully defined in law into the law. So logically, there is this dynamic of a pre-political culture or an ethos which nurtures the law, and hopefully good laws will strengthen the ethos, and so we can make even better laws. But this can also work in another direction. If we have a very weak ethos, we may lose the ability to see how the law is shaping our culture. And we will find that even under a correct, if you like, dispensation, relationships go wrong. So that this ethos is very important, and that seems to me where the churches have a particular role. And I think it's very important as we try to play this role that we shouldn't present as a lobby group with just a small handful of, if you like, I don't want to use a disparaging word, but housekeeping issues that need to be resolved. What we really want is the freedom to serve in that bigger picture. Now, on the island of Ireland, what could this mean? And here I'm just putting out some tentative ideas because I think everyone at this meeting knows more about it than me. But one very important area for the churches to have a voice is the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. I was very closely involved in that process. And I do feel that because it was approved by referendums and brought all the relationships into play, that it represents a possible turning point in which some of the tragic aspects of the past can be put behind us. And if you look to the international dimension, it seems to me that Ireland's credibility as an actor, or even I would say Britain's credibility as an actor, is tied to some extent to making this agreement work. A second issue obviously is, well, all these issues to do at the beginning and the end of life, where there is an advocacy role for the churches. There's another cluster of issues of an institutional character. And I put down heritage there because I think there's a growing interest, and this is in many countries, in what will become of buildings that may not be needed as much as before. These buildings were created for communities, and I think we should find ways of making sure that they somehow continue to serve community. A fourth area of engagement is critique of the economy and advocacy for the vulnerable, and I'll say more about that in a moment. And it seems to me that this fourth area is linked to the wider international context. And so a question for all the churches really is, if one could break down the different areas of engagement into categories, and maybe my categories are not the best, but if we break them down into categories, we can ask ourselves, where is the next big step forward going to happen? And I think if we make that big step forward, it will help all the areas. Everything will benefit. The church's strength and advocacy will benefit from doing any of these things well. Now, we're very privileged in my center in DCU to have a partnership with the Irish Council of Churches and Irish Interchurch meeting on 2 research projects. And I will just briefly describe them in turn. The project on the economics of belonging, it goes with the grain of the stated policies of the Northern Ireland Executive and the Irish government. I think in both jurisdictions, there's a willingness to look at what are sometimes called well-being indicators, or some way of measuring progress separate to GDP. Secondly, we're looking in that context at some issues with demonstration value. For example, in the area of housing and the area of child food poverty. And thirdly, we're trying to reimagine the role of local government. And this arises out of COVID to some extent, because communities were often very strong during COVID, and often the churches were very much part of that. And maybe there's something a lesson we can learn here. I would also emphasize that these research projects are multi-stakeholder. So we've brought in expertise of different kinds, including academic expertise. And I would add this fifth point, which I think is important. It's outreach to Muslims and other religious communities on the island. You might say some of them are, to a large extent, migrant communities, so they're vulnerable also for that reason. And concretely, we've engaged the Dublin City Interfaith Forum in our work, who work with both Christian churches and other religions. Now, at the global level, there are a number of slogans, if you like, that are already very much in play and are helpful. So one of them is the concept of a just transition on climate change. The word just there implies an ethical vision of the direction of society. And then under the Sustainable Development Goals, we speak of leaving no one behind or reaching the last first. And those are concepts that belong in the realm of ethics, not transactional diplomacy. So with the climate change agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, we have the beginnings of a common plan for humanity. And I think we need to remind ourselves what a huge achievement it is that all governments in the world subscribe to an agenda for transition on climate change, and all subscribe to leaving no one behind as we develop a sustainable economy. So the question is how to focus concretely on what that means. And it seems to myself and some of my friends who co-authored a recently published book on the role of religion in diplomacy that we need a common criterion of measurement. Maybe we could go to the next slide, and I won't dwell on it for very long, but we have worked on what we call 6 axioms of the historical or religious imagination. These would be principles that could unite people across cultures and across countries, on the assumption that we're on a journey towards a more just world. So the idea owes a great deal to the concept of middle axioms, which was developed before the Second World War by Archbishop William Temple and Oldham, who's a Presbyterian theologian. I forget his first name, but they developed the idea that between basic theology and day-to-day politics, you can develop axioms. And their thinking, which was mirrored in thinking in some other countries, made a major contribution to the welfare state, Beveridge, and the welfare state in Britain. And it also made a major contribution to, I believe, to European reconciliation after the war. The principle of European cooperation arose out of that kind of thinking. So we've been asking ourselves, what would be the equivalent in today's global situation? Maybe we could go to the next slide. As I said, probably in the end, the role of the churches, or the voice of the churches, is about hope. And I think there's a very straightforward reason for that, that we're on a journey without knowing the end point. We're a little bit like Abraham. And so on such a journey, it's very important that people should feel that there's still a community, even though the destination is uncertain. We're traveling companions, and traveling companions should be friends. And so for this journey, to know that we're on the right track, we need to apply these big words, which have somehow dropped out of political discourse to a large extent. So that's one way of imagining what the role of the churches can be. This is not something that would have been difficult for people to understand at other points in history. Something that I can remember is how we all came to the idea of development assistance when I was at school, and church bodies supported government policy in bringing development assistance to those in need. And everyone understood what it was all about. It was about values. But we seem nowadays to be more hesitant in that area. So could we just quickly go through the other slides? I just put in a few more slides, which this is the altar of peace in Rome, the Ara Pacis, which was completed, I think, in 9 BC. And I have very little doubt that St. Luke is referring to it in his gospel. If we can go to the next slide. The shepherds, they hear about peace in a different way, and a different kind of peace. The Emperor Augustus saw himself as a world historical figure who was bringing peace to the world. And this was a top-down peace. And the shepherds represent, if you like, the people who are on the margins of society. And the peace that they look forward to is different, though it may overlap and there may be some, convergence with the peace brought about by the emperor. If we go to the next, I think we have to recognize that we're not talking just about concepts here, but we're talking about people. And when I've been involved with presenting some of these ideas to students in particular, I try to use some examples. I'm just going to give 2 examples here, but one of them is Ken Saro-Wiwa in Nigeria, who was executed wrongly because of his work on behalf of indigenous people against Shell, in fact, and the then Nigerian government. Could we go to the next slide? Now, Jägerstätter is a great hero to me. I'm not sure how many people know his story, but he was almost on his own in Austria during the war in refusing to serve in the Wehrmacht. And he took a job as sacristan in his local parish in order to stay close to the church during his ordeal, because he knew that he was liable to be executed. And that tension was building up over several years, and he had small children. So he did this work, humble work in the church, as a way of preparing himself. When Franz Jägerstätter was about to be executed, to cut a long story short, his wife was brought to Berlin to try to talk him out of it. And she said to him, on the contrary, your decision is my decision. And in October 2007, Jägerstätter was beatified by the Catholic Church, and Franziska was present. So between 1943 and 2007, Jägerstätter came to be recognized as a hero, which had not been the case at the beginning. Now, this is an image. It's just to suggest the idea of a global spiritual retreat. As I understand it, Jewish people believe there's a certain time of the year when you go to a deeper reflection on the course of your life, and you try to somehow change, you try to change the course of history through a kind of acknowledgement of truth. And I think that's what we all need as we look at today's global economy, with all the inequalities that seem to be magnifying. And my last image is also about Yom Kippur. So that's what I wanted to say.